This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We are in the extreme early stages of a brand new limited format, Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And as usual, my first edition of Nitsa Notes, after the set review and before I've played enough of the format to have any real strong takeaways, is to sort of do a best commons and uncommons video, which is kind of a Cliff's Notes of my set review. If you don't have time to watch that really long content, this video can kind of get you ready for the format more quickly, because knowing what the best commons and uncommons are in each color goes a long way towards helping you know what you should be doing in this format. Alright, so let's dive right in with a look at White's three best commons. I think the third best White common is Sterling Supplier. You don't want a ton of 5-drops in most limited formats these days, but if you do have them, you want them to have some sort of effect that immediately impacts the board, and you want them to have evasion. Sterling Supplier definitely gets there. It is a pretty big body. A lot of stat lines have kind of gotten worse over the years, many of them actually, because, most power creep is restricted to creatures, at least for the most part. But a 5-mana 3/4 flyer is still a pretty solid creature. It comes down and it's bigger than most of the things that are around, and then this puts a counter somewhere. So it adds this very relevant body that's really easy to trade off with, and can often even, stop your opponent from attacking you, while also buffing something else that can attack right away. It's almost like it makes a 1/1 token with haste. You can kind of look at it that way sometimes with plus and plus one counters. Obviously, it's not identical to that effect, but you are adding a power to the board that you can do something with immediately. And, we saw in Brothers War a creature that was very similar, but it could only put the counters on soldiers. And it wasn't, insane, but it's fine. And this is obviously significantly better because it can put the counter on any other creature. You definitely don't want to be first picking this card, but I kind of imagine you want one of these in every single one of your White decks, just because it gives you pretty nice top curve that really impacts the board. I think the second best White common is Holy Cow, also has a hilarious name. A 3-mana 2/2 flyer is one of those stat lines that has gotten worse over the years. Kind of expect a 2/3 flyer now or a 3/2 flyer now when you pay that amount of mana. And while Holy Cow doesn't get there, it comes with a whole bunch of other effects. It's got Flash, which is great news for the blue-white decks, because they generally don't want to do anything on their own turn because they have all sorts of payoffs for not doing stuff on their turn, whether it's plotting or holding up cards with Flash or instants like Holy Cow. And Holy Cow can give you this reasonably efficient body, especially because it has Flash, and then also improve your draws a little bit and gain you some life. It just does a bunch of little things, and cards that do that give you all these different effects that are all beneficial, just tend to overperform in limited, and I imagine that's going to be the case here because it slots in nicely in a particular archetype in addition to just being a pretty good rate. I kind of hope you don't have to first pick Holy Cow, but I don't think it's a complete disaster if you do, and especially if you're in blue-white, you're going to be running, you'd probably run 4 of these if you can get them in blue-white. At number 1 for White, I've got Mystical Tether. White always gets, it seems these days, 2 generic and a white enchantment. Exile target creature until this thing leaves the battlefield. That's what Mystical Tether is. That is a very good rate. It doesn't gain you life like the one we saw in the last set, which was really good because removing a creature and gaining life is one of just the best things you can do when you're behind. It's also good when you're ahead, but it really helps you when you're behind. This doesn't gain you the life, but it does come with Flash upside. In the late game, if you have the mana available, there's not really a reason to cast Mystical Tether other than at instant speed, because you can generate blowouts, if your opponent tries to use a trick or something like that. And again, like Holy Cow, it's a card that slots in nicely to the blue-white deck, because you can just pass your turn, get all your little triggers for not doing anything during your turn, and then still utilize your mana. You just do it on your opponent's turn. So Mystical Tether is a great removal spell. This is something that's going to be, I think, a frequent first pick in the format. It's even splashable, which certainly matters sometimes. And I think White's best uncommon is a similar card. It's Lassoed by the Law. This can hit any non-land permanent, so it's broader than Mystical Tether, and it costs 1 more, at least as a base, in its base form. Mystical Tether costs 1 more than Lassoed by the Law when you flash it, obviously. But it also gives you a body, and that is a massive upgrade. I'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about black, but don't underestimate how much better it is when you add a body to the board and remove something. That is just huge. there's not much better that you can do in limited Magic than have that kind of effect. I mean, just look at something like Ravenous Chupacabra. I think that's the right Chupacabra. The one that was 2 generic and 2 black, destroys a creature when it enters the battlefield. Like, that kind of card is just incredibly strong. And that's basically what Lassoed by the Law is. It's a Banisher Priest, sort of, puts a 1/1 into play, which isn't as big as Banisher Priest. But the fact that the exile effect isn't attached to a creature is probably actually better, because creatures are the easiest thing to remove in limited, right? So if you were just playing a 1/1 that exiled an on-land permanent and then gave it back, that'd be worse, but you don't. This 1/1 is independent of Lassoed by the Law, so it's going to stick around as long as you want it to, and it even has an activated ability. Like, Lassoed by the Law is great, one of the better uncommons in the set, obviously, since I think it's White's best uncommon, and it's a very easy first pick. All right, let's move to blue now, where I think the third best blue common is Phantom Interference. So, this one, I might be a little biased. Mystic Snake is one of my favorite cards of all time. I love Draining Welk. I love any card that is a creature that counters a spell. Like, that's just one of the best feelings. It's the same as something like Lassoed by the Law, but it's not quite as good generally, because you have to have your mana up at the right time, and that's harder to do in limited. But it's similar, adding a body to the board and countering something, that gives you a 2-for-1. And the body you can potentially get here is a 2/2 flyer. And just everything this card does is pretty nice. None of it's like, you're not getting an insane rate, but, the 2 mana counter target spell unless its controller pays 2 generic. We've seen a card like that in lots of formats with like minimal upside, like in the last one, you can make something into a suspect, right? That's not that exciting, but it ends up being a perfectly solid playable, a perfectly solid thing to be doing on turn 2, and that's one of the things this can do. Because it has Spree, of course, you can choose to do one or both of these effects if you have enough mana, and if you pay the full 5, 3 generic, 1 generic, and the blue for its base cost, you counter a spell and make a 2/2 spirit with flying. When you do that, this is going to feel incredibly strong. And it's also nice that, when it isn't that good as a, quench, 1 generic and a blue counter target spell unless its controller pays 2, that does have somewhat diminishing returns. It can be useful up until the mid game. By the late game, when both players in top deck mode, it gets a lot less useful. But when you draw it then, it's not like other counter spells, because you can still do something. You still drew a card that adds a flying, a real evasive body to the board. Doesn't do it efficiently, but it does it. So the absolute ceiling here, when you pay 5 to cast this, it's going to feel like one of the more powerful cards in your deck, frankly. And that's not going to line up all the time, obviously. But when it does, it'll feel great. And then it has these other 2 modes that are perfectly fine when things line up for you to cast them. I don't think you want to first pick Phantom Interference. I kind of hope you do. I kind of hope the format turns out where this is just one of the best commons. But it probably won't be. I do think it's pretty good, but I don't think you want to first pick it. Next up, I've got Loan Shark. So 4 mana, 3/4. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast 2 or more spells this turn, draw a card. That would be a pretty good card in most formats if it just ended there. I mean, it wouldn't be insane. It'd be like a C- level card probably, because finding a way to draw with it would be kind of hard. But, you'd be able to do it often enough that it would be playable. Well, this format has a bunch of stuff going on, including what Loan Shark itself can do, that makes it way easier to cast 2 or more spells in a turn. Because it has plot, you can, obviously enough, plot it, and then pass your turn. And then on your next turn, you can play another card in your first main phase or second main phase. It doesn't really matter when you do it. You play something, and then you play Loan Shark, and then you draw the card. It just seems like this is going to be 4 mana, 3/4, draw a card, often enough for it to be a very good common. It's not quite that good. If that's all it was, if you just took plot out of the picture, and the loop, the hoop you have to jump through, and it was just 4 mana, 3/4, ETB, draw a card, it would be blue's best common and one of the best commons in the set. It would be an easy first pick. It does take a little bit of work, but the good news is there's a bunch of stuff with plot that makes it have some upside. The delay isn't always ideal. Sometimes you just have to run this out because you need a 3/4 body. Won't feel great when you do that, but it does have some upside. I've already mentioned the blue-white deck. Like, if you have something in play that pays you off for not casting a spell on your turn, and you spend that turn plotting Loan Shark, and then you still get value, that's going to feel awesome. Additionally, this card is, the if you've cast 2 or more spells this turn thing, it's geared most towards blue-red, which is the deck that cares the most about casting 2 spells in a turn. So, the plot thing here really makes this card into an excellent common. I could see this being better than I expect it to be. I'm not going to be super shocked if if plot in general ends up trending better than I thought it would. It's sort of like, the more I've thought about the format after doing the set review and everything, the more I've thought about it, it's kind of like sagas, where sometimes you pay a mana up front, and you don't get something awesome right away in most cases, but eventually you get something, and the efficiency of what you get is so good that it's okay that you had to wait. Kind of think that's what's going to happen with a lot of these plot cards, and I think Loan Shark will be a 2-for-1 often enough to be a very good common. I'm not right now thinking I want to first pick this, but I hope the format goes in a direction where that is what I want to do. And then I think blue's best common is Geyser Drake. So 2 generic and a blue 2/3 flyer. That is kind of the rate you expect when you spend that much mana. That's a pretty good flying creature these days. And then it has an effect that works really well with stuff going on in the format, and that is that it decreases the cost of spells you cast during your opponent's turn. Blue always has a lot of instants. If this just said instants you cast during your opponent's turn cost 1 less to cast, it'd be pretty good. But there's also a ton of flash in the format, especially in blue-white. You can really, find ways to take advantage of this discount, and that discount's no joke. It also works pretty well with blue-red, because that deck wants you to cast 2 spells in a turn, and you can be doing it during your opponent's turn. So, this slots in nicely into a couple of blue decks, and you'll play it in like every blue deck, because it's just a good card. Your deck's going to have instants in it, and it's going to be interested in having a 3-mana 2/3 flyer with upside. So I like Geyser Drake. It'd be cool if these other 2 commons end up being better than it, because I do think they're more interesting than Geyser Drake is. But for now, I think Geyser Drake is blue's best common. And I think blue's best uncommon is Outlaw Stitcher. So the base form of this card is 4 mana 1/4 that makes it 2/2. That's a playable card already. You would always play that card in virtually any limited format. You get 2 bodies, you get pretty good stats for the cost. But of course, since this is blue's best uncommon, it does way more than that. For one thing, when that token enters the battlefield, it gets 2 +1/+1 counters for each spell you've cast this turn other than the first. So, if you just do something like cast a 1 blue mana cantrip and then play Outlaw Stitcher, suddenly you get a 4 mana 1/4 and a 4/4. Okay? Like, that's pretty good, and it's not that far-fetched. Gets even less far-fetched because Outlaw Stitcher has plot. So, this means it's pretty easy for you to set this up so it comes into play as at least a 4/4, but it also works well with plot. So if you plotted something on turn 3, for example, and then your turn 4 is, play whatever card you plotted because you don't pay mana for it, and then play Outlaw Stitcher, you're still having an amazing turn. So it works on both sides. It works as a card that you want to plot so that you can make that zombie token even bigger, and it also works with plot. So you can play it on 4 after you've plotted some other stuff early. And there are going to be some times where you can set it up so that it's even bigger. Like, I don't think it's completely out of the question that you plot something on 2 and 3. You're going to be in a little bit of danger if you do that. You're going to end up kind of behind on board. But then you have this 4th turn where you play both of those other things, which are probably creatures, and then Outlaw Stitcher, and suddenly you're ahead. So Outlaw Stitcher just looks nuts. The base form of the card, like I said, is a card you always play. And then it has this huge upside where, if you're just making that token into a 4/4, this will feel absurd, and it's not going to be hard to do. So it's going to feel absurd a lot of the time. And that's what makes it blue's best uncommon. All right, let's move to black now. I think black's 3rd best common is Consuming Ashes. So, removal has fallen off a lot of late, especially expensive removal. If we're talking 2 or 1 mana, or cards that add to the board in addition to removing, it's kind of a different animal. But if we're talking like 4 mana removal, even that can exile anything, like this, just not what it used to be. There's too many into the battlefield abilities, there's too much ward, there's too many things, too much haste, too many things that happen where, yeah, you cast this and it kills your opponent's thing, but you kind of come out behind these days. Like, it happens too much. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes your opponent plays a big dumb 6 mana 6/6, and just hitting it with Consuming Ashes is great. But these things have gotten worse. There's a time where this would just be black's best common, but we're not in that time anymore. We're in a time where 4 mana removal that doesn't really do enough other than remove a thing just isn't as good as it used to be. Now, I still think it's black's 3rd best common, don't get me wrong, but this, like I said, would have been number 1 like 2 years ago, probably, the best black common, and it would have just been a lot better. But we're not there anymore. Now, having to pay 4 to exile a creature, you're often going to end up with a mana disadvantage. This tries to pay you off for that a little by surveilling 2, if you kill something small with it. And that helps. That makes it feel less less clunky. But there are going to be too many times where you cast this and you're like, man, it's really sad that I have to kill this thing that had haste and enter the battlefield ability, and it only costs 2 mana, but I have to kill it. You know, like that's not going to feel good, and that's how these removal spells have felt of late. But it does exile, and that does matter, because one of the problems with a card like Murder, which, you know, is on the bonus sheet in this set, so there you go. You know, it's 3 mana, destroy target creature. You pay 1 more here, but exiling's a big upgrade because, you know, I mentioned all these things that creatures have now that make removal worse. One of them is death triggers, and Consuming Ashes at least turns those off. You know, it doesn't care about them because the creature gets exiled. So, you know, you're going to be pretty happy, I guess, with the first copy of this. Beyond that, you're going to kind of wish you could get your hands on some cheaper removal. But I do think because this can answer anything, you know, it deserves to be a relatively high pick. Just be ready for the times where just you're not that happy with it as a removal spell. There are going to be times where you're really happy too. So, you know, it sort of evens out. Number 2, for black, I've got Vault Plunderer. So 3 mana, 3/1. Target player draws a card and loses 1 life. That's just a good rate. It's pretty easy to 2-for-1 with this because of its high power. It's good sacrifice fodder. It has an outlaw creature type. And in a pinch, it can even commit crimes. You don't normally want to give your opponent a card, but if they're at 1, or, you know, getting 2 or 3 crime triggers on your board is better than giving them a card, which is not going to happen that often. But, you know, if you can win the game thanks to this, making your opponent draw a card, you're going to do it. And that's real upside on a card that, even if it could only target you, would already be a pretty good card. Now, one thing that might keep Vault Plunderer in check a little bit is the fact that it has 1 toughness, and that makes it pretty bad against mercenary tokens. So as an attacker, there are going to be a lot of boards where it isn't good. And even as a blocker, you know, if your opponent's just, if you have like Vault Plunderer in play, even though it drew you a card, trading for a 1/1 token doesn't sound great. Still, I think it will give you a legit full blown 2-for-1 often enough to be a very good black common. And I think it's probably borderline first pickable because it slots into so many different decks in the format with synergy, in addition to just being a good base card. And I think black's best common is Nozumi Linkbreaker. So, you know, they've been really pushing 1-drops lately, and this is a pretty pushed one. You pay 1 mana and you get a 1/1 and another 1/1 with upside. And that's really good. Like, we never see 1 mana 1/1s that leave behind 1/1s not be good in limited. And in fact, they usually see play in constructed too, just because, you know, when you're paying the least amount of mana possible, or close to it, I guess you can pay 0 sometimes for things, right? But when you're paying 1 mana and you're getting this much value, it's really good. And this is another card that slots in synergistically, in addition to just being a good 1-drop. So synergy-wise, it works nicely because both of the bodies it makes are outlaws. So like in black-red, that's going to matter. Additionally, black-white is about sacrificing things. You can sacrifice this. You know, you get 2 pieces of material to sacrifice here. So that's really going to matter. So like Vault Plunderer, it's just like a really good rate. And then it gets this extra bump because of the amount of synergy within black decks that it offers you. So, like Vault Plunderer, I think it's a borderline first pick. It just seems like, you know, a lot of value for 1 mana. A pretty pushed 1-drop. And I should note, too, like, the Mercenary token is a really strong token. Like, you know, I said that some in the set review, but I haven't said it in this video. We're used to getting tokens that don't do anything, and of late, we've gotten several that can't even block. You know, normally we get like vanilla 1/1s. I guess we had the toxic ones that couldn't block. But a 1 mana 1/1 that can block and has another ability is like a huge difference from a regular token. Like, it's a significant upgrade. It's not just some random 1/1, and that definitely matters. I think black's best uncommon, and this is where I wanted to talk about how big of a difference it makes to add a body to the board, because I think black's best uncommon is Unfortunate Accident. And I had Consuming Ashes as only the 3rd best common, but I have this as the best uncommon, right? Well, like I said when talking about Lassoed by the Law, adding a body to the board and killing something is vastly different than, you know, just killing something. And this has a couple of different modes. I mean, you can just cast it as murder when you have to, and sometimes you'll have to. You have a much better chance when you cast Unfortunate Accident of surviving another turn or multiple turns, even if you're behind, than you do if you cast Consuming Ashes. Because Consuming Ashes just gives you one thing, and that's exiling the creature. Unfortunate Accident gets rid of your opponent's best creature and gives you a 1/1, which like really increases your chances of winning the game, and certainly of drawing the game out and trying to find a way to win. So it's just a huge upgrade to add a body to the board when you use a removal spell, as opposed to just a removal spell. So, you know, you can also make the token in a pinch. Like, there might be times where your mana's screwed and the only thing you can do is make the 1/1. It's not ideal, but it's upside on a card that's already good. You have the option of just murder, you have the option of just a token, and ideally, you get both. All right, let's move to red now, where I think the third best common is erasable Wolverine. So, 3 mana, 3/2. When it enters, you exile the top card of your library, and until the end of the turn, you can play that card. That would already be playable, believe it or not. Sure, you can't really play it on 3, or you shouldn't unless you have no other choice, because you're not going to be able to do anything with the card you reveal. But playing it on 4 and not playing your land drop for the turn and playing the Wolverine is pretty good. You're going to hit a land like, I don't know, 40% of the time and just play it. That's drawing a card. And then when you get it later in the game, there's a very good chance that whatever it is it hits, you can just cast or play or whatever with whatever it draws you. So getting a 2-for-1 with the Wolverine, even without plot in the equation, is a pretty realistic outcome. Early, you can do it by hitting a land drop. Sometimes you won't, and you know that's okay when you don't. And then late, when when you're in top deck mode, you can be like slam the Wolverine, reveal a spell, cast the spell. That feels really good. But it also has plot. So actually taking advantage of the card in the earlier stages of the game is even easier, provided you take a turn off by casting the Wolverine. But like with a lot of these plot cards, sure, you don't add anything to the board on 3 if you decide to do it this way. But on your next turn, you're going to have a big turn. You know, that's true in general with plot cards, but this one increases the chances of that because it's also drawing you a card. So getting a 2-for-1 with the Wolverine is very doable, and especially so with plot. So it's a very nice common. Again, not one, I don't think it's quite a first pickable one, though. It wouldn't shock me. Like, if it's even easier to generate a 2-for-1 here, then I think it is going to be a card you want to first pick. I think the second best red common is Prickle Pair. This is, we have, lots of sets have the same kinds of cards in them these days, and 3 mana 2/2 that makes a 1/1 is always a good common. Red often likes to go wide, and it certainly does in this format, so that works out nicely. So it's good in like a red-white deck. Also, both of these bodies are Outlaws. That's good for the black-red deck. And, the rate is just good anyway, but then it has this extra synergy around because of, what the format wants you to do. So just a very good common, and this is one I think you can first pick. And then I think red's best common, it's removal. It's explosive derailment. So, this is 3 mana to do 4 to something, sort of as a baseline. And by something, I mean creature. It can't hit players. That'd be nice. Can only hit creatures. That's a card you always play in limited. Like, it might be the third best red common. If it ended there, it would still be a good card. Probably just slightly short of being premium, but pretty close. But this has Spree. So it's another one of these Spree cards that fares quite nicely, I think. Now, you're not going to always be able to do it. There aren't so many artifacts in the format. Like, if this were an artifact-heavy format, this would be completely nuts, because a 2-for-1 would be almost automatic. It's not quite automatic here, but there are enough artifacts that I think each time you draft Explosive Derailment, it wouldn't be shocking if you blow up one artifact with it. And those 2-for-1s are great. It's also a way, of course, to commit a crime at instant speed, which matters sometimes. I think red's best uncommon is Cunning Coyote. I mean, this is what red does best, right? Just play a 2-mana 2/2 with haste. Like, that's exactly what red wants. And the Coyote is that, which is, again, like I've said about a lot of these cards that manage to make best commons and uncommons, 2-mana 2/2 haste is a card you always play in your red decks in limited. But this has big upside because it can offer +1/+1 in haste to something else. The haste isn't always going to matter if you're just curving out, as one often will in a red deck. If you play a 1-drop on turn 1 and then play Cunning Coyote on turn 2, suddenly you're attacking your opponent with 2/2/2s, and they're probably not going to be able to block them very effectively. That's a pretty good outcome. You also have the later game play, where you play more than one creature, and the Coyote comes down, adds damage to the board out of nowhere, while also buffing another creature and giving it haste, so you're adding even more damage to the board out of nowhere. And of course it has plot, which helps you set that up even more effectively, where you can just slam 2 creatures in a turn and take advantage of the haste. No matter what, like, that ETB is good. If it only get +1/+1, It would be a good card. Like, if it only gave haste, it wouldn't be that good. But if it only gave +1/+1, it would be pretty good. But it gives +1/+1 in haste, opening up these massive damage scenarios where your opponent is simply unprepared for 2 haste creatures. Like, you know, and you can do it without even plotting. Like, you know, on turn 4, you play another 2-drop and then Cunning Coyote, swing with both, you know? Like, those things are going to happen, and it's going to happen all the time. In addition to the fact that just running this out on 2 and smashing it in usually means it's going to get in for like 4. If it doesn't, your opponent has to kill it for usually like 2 mana, sometimes for 1, which doesn't feel great. But it's hard to deal with Cunning Coyote in the early game that efficiently. And if they don't, it's going to do a ton of damage. And then it's just good all game because of how its ability can line up to add damage to the board out of nowhere. So it's just a great uncommon. It's like sort of a typical red uncommon in terms of, you know, it's just sort of a super efficient 2-drop. That leaves us with green, where I think green's 3rd best common is Giant Beaver. Once again, this is a card, 4 mana, 4/4 vigilance, nothing else on the card. Probably makes the cut more often than it doesn't. That's just a big old creature, especially a common. And then it has this upside. It's not insane upside. You know, it's not that easy to saddle it, but it does grow the things that saddle it. And, you know, that might sound sort of awkward. It's like, okay, cool, I get a counter, but my creature's tapped. And that's true. But because the Beaver itself has vigilance, rumbling with it, and then also having it as a blocker, makes it a little less painful to do that. And then on your next turn, you can reap the benefits of that counter, which, you know, probably means you have a significantly better attack if that's what you wanted to do anyway. So, Giant Beaver, really good, efficient creature. I think green's 2nd best common is Hard Bristle Bandit. It's hard to say no to 2 mana 1/1s that tap for mana of any color. They tend to play pretty well. The big downside about them that can get them in some trouble is, like, they're not that good at doing anything else other than producing mana in the early stages of the game. You know, you're not going to be able to block your opponent's Cunning Coyote with this, for example. You know, that's not good news. But kind of like the plot mechanic, the mana this gives you will help you pull ahead on a future turn, because you can play your 4-drop on turn 3. You know, it also fixes your mana, which really matters. The crime part will come up sometimes. Like, if you have one of these in play, you can tap it for mana, then play like a tap desert, and it's almost like you played the desert untapped in that case. Like, if you're doing things that can untap it for no mana and can do it during a main phase, it's going to feel pretty good. And it's not impossible, but I wouldn't put a ton of weight into that. I wouldn't look at this as, I'm going to produce 2 mana with this every time I play it, because it's not going to happen. But it will happen sometimes. And when it does, it's going to feel pretty good on top of a card that's already pretty solid. I think green's best common is a removal spell. I think it's Throw from the Saddle. You know, there was a time where just target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature your opponent controls. Rabid Bite is what that card was. There was a time when that was green's best common. And they continue to push these removal spells for limited. And this one's pushed, I mean, 2 mana for +1/+1, and that effect, it means your smaller creature can punch up really efficiently, and kill an opponent's creature without too much trouble. And then usually, like frequently, this kind of buff also means your creature can attack more effectively. Like when you do that, I mean, it's not quite a 2-for-1, but if you blow up something that's bigger than it and then can attack with that creature into a creature of the same size it can only trade, that feels great. It feels even better when you kill their only blocker and then smash in with everything and get this +1/+1. And then, if you use this on a mount, that +1/+1 sticks around beyond that turn because it's a counter. So, you know, there are a lot of mounts, especially in green-white, which is like the mount deck. Getting a counter out of this isn't that hard. You know, use it on your Giant Beaver, for example. You know, Throw from the Saddle looks super efficient, a really, really good common. I think green's best uncommon, it's kind of like Cunning Coyote, where it's a card that just is like so much value for so little mana. And this one I think even gets there even higher, and that's Aloe Alchemist. Base form, 2 mana 3/2 trample. Yep, I'm playing that, and I'm usually pretty happy about it. But this has plot, and unlike most cards with plot, Aloe Alchemist does something when you plot it. It gives +3/+2 and trample to one of your creatures. That is a huge boost. That's going to turn virtually any creature into a threat, and there are going to be times where it just wins you the game because you use it on a big creature, suddenly your opponent can't chump the way they wanted to, game over, right? And when you think about it, you know, this one feels more like a saga than the others because it actually does something when you plot it. There's also a red card that I almost had as Red's Best Uncommon that does something when you plot it. And Aloe Alchemist does it. So it's almost like a saga where it's like Chapter 1, give something +3/+2 and trample for 2 mana. Chapter 2, get a 3/2 trample, right? Like, that's an amazing card if you think of it that way. If you've played with sagas, you know how nuts that sounds. That's pretty much what this is, except it also has the upside of just running out the 3/2 trample if you have to. So it's even better. You know, usually a saga would have a third Chapter 2 to be fair, but you know what I'm saying. So Aloe Alchemist gives you crazy value. 2 mana total, that's how much you spend, and you end up with 6/4 trampling worth of stats for that amount of mana. That's insane value. Also a 2-drop, and we're in an era where 2-drops are just super important, and the better they are, the better the color is going to be usually. So I think that's green's best uncommon, and I think that's all the best commons and uncommons in the set. We'll see how things shake out in the end. The format seems really fun. I'll be posting draft videos of it and talking about it every Saturday for the next several weeks in Needs and Notes. Unfortunately, they did a smaller early access event this time, to make it easier for them to run, I guess. And I didn't make the cut, so I don't have draft videos up as early as some other people who got the invitation. But I'll be putting up draft videos as soon as the format does become available on Arena for everyone else. All right, that will do it for this video. Thank you for watching. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, including my set review for this format, where I talk about every single card, not just the best commons and uncommons, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.